Oh. We're in Hull with Bone Machine.
Yes, sat down on the Humber Riviera, the sunniest, loveliest part of Hull. We're behind a lovely craft beer bar on one of the hippest, coolest streets in Hull, and it's very good exposure for us. We have people walking past these windows all day, peering in, asking what smells so good, and that's what we make, it's the beer.
The brewery started in Pocklington.
Yes, out in Pocklington to begin with, and we moved into these premises in Hull in 2019. So we're coming up to 3 years now we've been here, and we've certainly made the place our own. We've put all of these tanks in ourselves and turned what was a bit of a shabby old place into quite a functioning brewery.
Most of your sales is based locally. How do you interact with the local beer scene?
There are multiple beer festivals over the course of a year here in Hull. And lots of good drinking establishments, and more of them popping up all the time, it seems, at the moment. So we have a fantastically charismatic salesperson who's one of the owners, Kimmy, and he has a very good relationship with lots of bars in the local area. And so we have a lot of permanent lines on at various different bars and pubs, where they have a tap dedicated to just our beer and just us, and we will keep them stocked in beer. We have obviously the bar based around the brewery here. They always have our beer on, a number of our beers, but there are a couple of other bars in Hull which have multiple ones of our beers on as well. We work with restaurants, providing them with beers, sometimes boutique beers that we've made specifically for them, also with food halls and even a takeaway. They've come after us for some beer with their own branding on, so it's certainly something that we enjoy doing, is working with local businesses of other genres.
Your next door neighbours, vegan,
yes,
Asian food place.
Indeed.
Did a beer for them.
We brought in their executive chef, decided what kind of flavours is he using a lot, what kind of flavours are we able to put into a beer, and what kind of flavours would complement the food. And so we ended up going for some lemongrass and some kaffir lime leaf into this beer to pair with this Pan-Asian food. We didn't want it to be overpoweringly flavoured because it has to pair well with the food and not overpower, so we thought we'd better keep it fairly simple in terms of the flavour profile. So the lemongrass adds this fantastic kind of, again, lemon sherbety-esque flavour, and the kaffir lime leaf has that edge, that zing within it, just the right level of bitterness added, obviously paired with some hops. I believe we used some Cascade in that brew, and what we've ended up with is a 4.5% pale ale.
Yeah.
I do like that.
That's got a really good balance.
There are some flavour adjuncts in it. There is the lemongrass, there is the lime, but it's still beer flavoured. And this, with some of the lovely artisanal Pan-Asian food, it's going to pair perfectly. They're going to complement each other without overpowering one another. It's, like I say, balance the beer through and through. We don't have any automation here. When we're taking the grains out to the mash tun, we don't even have a hatch to take it out the bottom. We have to scoop the mash out the top with a shovel. I save a lot of money per month on not needing a gym membership by working here.
Do you think that adds to the beer?
It certainly means we're more involved with the entire process. And whether to be an anomaly in the brew and something to go not as we'd planned, we would notice for certain, because we are face to face with the brew the entire way through. The more pain involved, the better it takes, of course. The harder the work, the better the product. I don't think I'd like this job even half as much if I was just sat behind a control board pressing buttons and switches. I don't think that would be the job for me. I much prefer it being as hands-on, manual and physical as it is. So, we have the brew house side of the brewery over here. A hot water tank, or a hot liquor tank, where we keep our hot treated water. Hull has got very hard water, and so we need to do a lot of mineral balancing in order to get the right kind of quality to the beer, just because of the nature of Hull's water being incredibly hard. But that is very beneficial for dark beers, so it does work in our favour on some occasions. Then we have our little mash tun here, where we mix the grain with the water. That's where we convert the starch stored in the grains into fermentable carbohydrates, which is what the yeast likes to eat and turn into alcohol. So we mash in for a very certain temperature, and that activates certain enzymes which are present in the malted grain. And those enzymes will convert starch, how the grain stores its energy, into shorter chain fermentable carbohydrates for us. So that's the mash tun. There is a false bottom in the bottom to filter out the grain, so what we get out is just liquid. That's then called the wort.
The wort comes through past an underback, which is also known as a whirlpool. That spins the liquid wort around and helps to filter out any of the grain that made its way through the false bottom. And then we pump out just the liquid wort into our copper, our kettle, our boiler. As the name suggests, it boils. It's got a couple of heating elements in there, and the wort in there will be boiled for at least an hour. This helps to concentrate down the wort itself, as well as to sterilize the entire mixture, because it's very important that this wort is sterile, so that when we eventually come to add our yeast, that is the only microorganism or bug in there. We don't want any extraneous wild yeasts or, God forbid, bacteria in there, as they will compete with our house yeast, and we simply don't want that. This is also where we'll be adding the first couple of the first few opportunities for hop additions are in the hopper, in the boiler. You can add hops at the very beginning of a boil to get bitterness out of those hops. Very popular for bitter, can you believe it, or a stout or a porter. Or you may add hops towards the end of the boil, perhaps 5 minutes before the end of the boil. Those will be thought of as aroma hops, and from those you get much less bitterness, much more fruity, citrusy, aromatic compounds out of that. So once the wort and the hops have been boiled in here, we send it through a pump, through a hop catcher, through a heat exchanger. The heat exchanger's job is to cool down the wort from a scorching 100 degrees to a nice toasty 28 degrees. Now, some of you might think that sounds a bit warm, and for normal yeast that would be a bit warm. However, we're using Kviek, specifically Sigmund's Voss, which is a Norwegian farmhouse isolate strain of yeast, which prefers the temperatures to be a little bit warm. A normal, say, ale yeast doesn't like anything above 25. In fact, it produces phenols should it go above 25. We go in at 28 to begin with, and the yeast will increase the temperature itself up to perhaps about 40 degrees, so really quite warm. That would be bad news for a normal yeast, but for our super Norwegian yeast, that's just the perfect conditions. We also oxygenate the wort as it goes through the heat exchanger, so that as the yeast is reproducing, it is also able to respire.
We've currently got a glass full of Garden of Death, which is probably our flagship beer. It's a New England IPA, very fashionable at the minute. Well, they've certainly been fashionable for a few years. This is a 7%er, very hoppy, very juicy. We've got Chinook and Mosaic in there, I believe some Cascade as well. And it's our most popular beer. I think if that was the only beer we made, we still couldn't make enough of it.
Yeah, nice bitterness.
It's our flagship for a reason. It's an incredibly well-balanced beer and doesn't taste anything like 7%, which it is. It's dangerously easy drinking.
This is a core beer, and you also produce more experimental batches.
Yes, our core range would probably consist of about 10 or 12 beers that we do very repeatedly, very consistently all the time. But then we also do sometimes one-off special occasion beers. Obviously some very seasonal things going on. We do more sours and lighter beers coming into the summer, and in the winter we tend to focus more on the darker beers and the stouts.
We send the wort into one of our great big fermenting vessels, FVs. These are 2,500 litre vessels, so they'll actually hold 2 batches of the beer that we produce. As we produce between 1,000 and 1,200 litres in a single brew day. So what we're able to do is brew the same beer one day after another, and put them both into the same tanks for a double batch. So they go into, the wort comes into here at about 28 degrees, and then we put the yeast in. The yeast starts to ferment out the sugars that we managed to extract from the grains, and we see that sugar disappear and be converted into alcohol. We measure that with a hydrometer, and that shows us the density of the beer at that point, and as the density decreases, we know that the alcohol content is increasing. That's how we measure how strong the beer is. Once the desired level of alcohol has been produced, once the desired amount of sugar is left remaining, we will cold condition the beer. So we drop the temperature, it makes the yeast go dormant and fall out of solution. And we also add dry hops at that point, so that's where you get your big hoppy punch from. So we have hoppy pellets which go into the top of these tanks, and that's where you get your super hoppy IPAs and your occasional double dry hop when we're feeling especially indulgent, I suppose. We also have a number of other fermenters down here. These are slightly smaller, so-called single batches of beer. These two are currently fermenting. These have got some soon-to-be fruit beers coming out of them, a fruited IPA and a citrus pale ale. And then we have some round bottom fermenters over here. So we tend to use these for dark beers or bitters, or sours in fact, which don't have the amount of dry hops in, because the round bottoms are, it's just preferable to use a round bottom for a beer like that rather than conical. Further down the brewery, we also have a carbonation tank. This is where we force carbonate our beer through the carb stone by pumping in CO2 through a very porous piece of metal, which produces microscopic bubbles of CO2, which are in turn dissolved into the beer. And we can measure how much CO2 is dissolved in the beer so that we make sure we achieve the correct amount of carbonation, so you don't have any cans blowing up in your fridge, or similarly you don't have any soft squishy cans.
Well, you have the house yeast, which is the Kviek yeast.
Yeah, we use a specific Kviek called Sigmund's Voss. That's our preferred strain of Kviek. And yes, almost all of our beers are done with Kviek, apart from obviously lagers and our dark beers, our porters and stouts, which don't take to Kviek very well. But certainly all of our pale ales we use Kviek, even our bitters we use Kviek, and often our sours as well. Once we've allowed the lactobacillus to do its souring job, we will then use Kviek for the actual fermentation.
How did you collect the Kviek as your house yeast?
That would have come from Mark, our executive brewer. He studied brewing at Heriot-Watt University up in Edinburgh. He arrived at Kviek as being the best option for us through his education there. I certainly know of some scientific papers and studies exploring different kinds of yeast, and they almost always tend to conclude that Kviek is the most effective, the fastest acting, the hardiest of all the strains of yeast. And I certainly love the flavour it produces, and can't knock the idea that it produces beer in a shorter time frame. It does reduce our turnaround time on a brew significantly, using a yeast that prefers these higher temperatures and thus performs so much faster. We can produce a 7% beer like the beer you're drinking right now, and that will take perhaps 4 days of fermentation, which is incredibly fast in the industry. I tend to pitch in at 28 degrees for Kviek, although I have on one occasion made the mistake of pitching the Kviek yeast in at 60 degrees. And I thought, well, there's a batch ruined, but Kviek was perfectly happy at 60 degrees. So it just goes to show that this is a especially hardy yeast. It's rather a beast of a yeast.
Do you find that certain hops work very well for Kviek yeast?
We tend to lean towards American and New Zealand and Australian hops, and we tend to find they complement the yeast very well. The yeast, the Kviek that we use, often adds a kind of lemon sherbet-esque flavour to it, and so we often pair that with hops that arrive at a kind of a stone fruit kind of taste. So we're talking things like Nelson Sauvin is one of our absolute favourites coming out of New Zealand, and that has a lovely kind of plum stone fruit kind of flavour. Or Galaxy coming from Australia, that's one of our favourites, and that's kind of bringing some peach with it as well. But then you can also take it the other way with some of these hops. So something like a Rakau, a New Zealand hop that we use a fair amount of, certainly in Cloudpiercer, our New Zealand pale ale, brings with it some pepperiness. That's just a slight hint of spice, because it doesn't all need to be super citrusy and fruity. There can be, well, there certainly is a place for a bit of depth and spice to your hops as well, rather than everything just being a total juice bomb. You can create more balance by using something that draws on a different part of the flavour spectrum.
When you started, you were one of the breweries using it, but now it is slightly more common.
It's become fairly ubiquitous. Lots of breweries will do one-off Kviek, so it will be they'll use Kviek for one of their brews, and they'll produce a Kviek IPA, which is fantastic. The more people who get to know about this yeast, the better. But there are still very few breweries who use it as their house yeast, and I do believe we were one of the first in the country who did that, which is a small claim to fame for us. But I wouldn't have it any other way. In fact, I don't look forward to using other yeasts. I've been spoiled that we use Kviek for everything, because now when we use normal ale yeasts, I'm terribly bored waiting for it to do its thing.
Some bars, including bars that we have permanent lines in, they like a cask beer, they like a classic traditional best bitter, and we have a fantastic example right here in our tank. 3.6% with Magnum hops and a lovely malty backbone, hence the name backbone. Let's use it.
So,
this has still got at least one more week of conditioning left on it, perhaps longer. We like to condition all of our beers for a minimum of 2 weeks, but often we condition them for 4+ weeks. And that's where the quality comes from. The longer you condition, the better the quality. This beer is a well-conditioned beer, and will be by the time we serve it. Cheers.
cheers.
There's still some more hop action going on in there than you might not necessarily normally expect from a very plain bitter. There is some more going on there, and I absolutely adore this. The colour is perfect. This was brewed with Kviek as well. You won't find many bitters brewed with Kviek. It's quite a brave move to do that, but it works beautifully. It really does. In fact, I think that's the thing that really sets this apart from other mainstream bitters, is the use of Kviek yeast, because otherwise the hops are fairly similar to what any other brew might use. It's the yeast in this that's really doing a lot of the legwork.
Where did the name Bone Machine come from?
So the name Bone Machine came from a Tom Waits album. I believe it was an album released in the 70s. In fact, we have a couple of beers also named after songs of his, one of which is the Swordfish Trombone that I'm drinking now, which is probably the best named beer we have, which is a Tamarind Blanche, so a Belgian wheat beer style, specifically the French-speaking region of Belgium. And we've got some tamarind in there to give it some depth and some body, quite frankly. For our Belgian beer, we use a mixture of both Belgian wheat yeast and Kviek yeast as well, so they're working in tandem collaboration, and that definitely brings in some lovely ester flavours with using both of those together. You know, you get some of the lovely banana clove kind of flavours from the Belgian wheat yeast, but you also bring in some lovely lemon sherbety flavours from the Kviek as well. They work very well in tandem.
Russian heavy metal is an ethos of your brewery?
Very much so. The two owners of the brewery are two brothers who are both very keen and talented musicians, and that's certainly the genre of music that they tend to lean towards, and certainly very heavily influenced by the bands back where they are from in Finland, which obviously tends to be a lot of heavy metal. We're quite a musician-based brewery as well. We often collaborate with bands and do beers for bands. If a band that we are particularly friendly with are, say, releasing a new album or a new single, we may well brew a beer with the album artwork or the single artwork on the label of the can, and sell that on behalf to sort of increase the visibility for both our brewery to the musicians' fans and the musician to fans of our brewery. And so we've done that for a number of different bands, both in this country and abroad as well. We've worked with Irish and Italian bands before. And so yes, we definitely like working with musicians. It's one of the things that we really pride ourselves on.
Do you try and let the music sort of influence your brewing?
Absolutely so, yes. And we often, where possible, we have the musicians in the brewery with us whilst we're brewing. We make a day of it, and so we bring them in, and they get to see how the beer's made. They get to assist in the making of their beer and say, you know, I helped to make that beer. But it certainly just depends on the style of music that we're dealing with. So there's a local indie band that we did a beer for, and that was a very sessionable pale ale verging on an American amber beer. Would be very drinkable at a gig here in Hull, whereas there is another band who we've worked with who are incredibly heavy metal, almost industrial music, and for them, rather than a light pale ale, we thought we should do something suitable for that style of music, so we did an imperial stout. In fact, we've done two different iterations of that beer now, both 10.5% imperial stouts, one with coffee and one with cacao and raspberry in there, and we're soon to do a barrel-aged version as well, and that's very in keeping with that band and their ethos, and so it depends entirely on the musician.
With your lighter beers, Kviek yeast is part of identity. Do you try and work that identity into dark beers?
Certainly we do. It's tricky because we're using a much more standard ale yeast for these dark beers, but we want to always keep the same kind of balance that we achieve in our pale ales with our dark beers, and so it needs to be rich and full-bodied and have the right amount of bitterness, but we don't want anything syrupy. We don't want anything with too to taste like molasses. It still needs to be drinkable and not too heavy. So we tend to try and keep our dark beers. Even our 10.5% imperial stout is incredibly light in terms of mouthfeel and light-bodied for such a dark, extremely strong beer. And in no way is it syrupy or slimy or sticky at all. It's still a nice, crisp beer.
We got the canning line installed during the first lockdown, as well, it was impossible to get cans done externally during the lockdown, and so we made the investment, got this canning room set up, and now we can produce up to 2,000 cans in one single session here. It's a bit of a slog, but we can do it. We put some good music on and we just groove to it. And the canning line is a fairly simple affair. It purges the cans with CO2 first to prevent oxidization, and then we fill them with lovely beer, make sure that it's nice and domed on top to push out any extra air, and place the lid on top, put it onto the seamer, fold it over once, fold it over twice. That's the hermetic seal for you. That should keep the beer nice and fresh for at least a year. And that is the very bare bones of what we do in this brewery.